Well, the way I want to begin first is simply quietly, deliberately, and carefully simply say thank you very much from the Academy, family, friends, people I've worked with for years. It's been an unbelievable treat to be here tonight, to listen to Carol's story, but also to have my grandchildren, my daughters, my sister, my brother-in-law, and all these old friends. At age 80, I don't expect lots more of these events. So, this is a matter of what Bob Ball would call realism applied to life. So let me say that and hold that thought. It's heartfelt, and I don't know how else to underscore it. What I want to do in my time is address the theme of a lot of the work that I've done by myself, but often, and indeed mostly, with colleagues from university like Jerry Mashaw from Yale and John Pakutka and John Oberlander and Jim Marone, some of whom will be speaking. It's not a matter of allocating intellectual responsibility. It's a matter of explicating what it came to be to take on what we regarded, all of us, as the combination of myths, mischief, and misunderstanding that dominates, in our view, the discussion of public programs called social insurance by those who understand it. So that's what I want to make some observations about. But before I do that, in spirit, really, of Carol's stories about how we got there. I mean, we've known each other a long time as well, and it's amazing how the decades happen to move without asking for permission. And I must say, Amy's regard, I really felt as if I were some kind of tribal leader who was off in the distance somewhere, who years ago made some effect. But wasn't that a spirited and very generous response by her? I must say, I was touched by that, and I will thank her very much. So I want to make three kinds of observations about what I take to be the semi-muddled state of affairs regarding the discussion of social insurance programs of all kinds, the principles and the practice. Before I get there, I want to tell a story on myself. I want to tell a story about how I came to be part of this world as a California kid who ended up, because I was a quarterback, and that was in the Doug Flutie period of quarterbacks, who ended up on the East Coast in a world that was very different from the one I grew up in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles. So here's the story. I've now finished college. I finished graduate school. I'm in a postdoc. It's 1966. I'm writing a book that eventually became The Politics of Medicare, happily still in print all these years. That may be because nobody else is interested in the origins of it. That's always a possibility. I refuse to entertain that very long. I have this postdoc to write this book. I interview everybody I can possibly think of, from the head of the AMA to the head of the AHA to labor union leaders to even Russell Long. And I must, as I recall that interview at his office in the Senate. And he asked me 6 times whether I wanted the gin and tonic. I said yes for 3. But he went on to 6. And it was the most candid, incoherent interview I've ever done in my life. But I got a lot of good information because his barriers were down. All right, so I'm trying to do this work. I've got a 150-page manuscript. One of the professors in my program, in the postdoc program, sympathizes my inability to get an interview, writes Wilbur Cohen a note. I still recall, I can see him now, turning to this Olivetti typewriter on a little container and putting a carbon copy and saying, "The Honorable Wilbur J. Cohen, would you please do me a favor and see Ted Marmor. We'll send you his blah, blah, blah. So you got the picture? He was helping me, the way I tried to be helpful to Amy. Cohen writes back, sure, see the young man. Send his manuscript. I'll see him in the last Tuesday of May 1966, right? This is after Medicare has been, it's before it's going to be put into operation July 1. Send it along, and I'll see him that time. I go down. I knock on the door. There's an inner office and an outer office. It's the bigger offices than I was used to. Mr. Cohen comes out, and you saw a picture of him in the project before, in Carol's representation. And he shakes my hand. And I don't know whether you could tell the difference between Ball and Cohen, but Cohen was about 5'5". Ball was about 6'1". They cooperated, but they were very different types, at the very least physically. And Wilbur says to me, or Mr. Cohen, as I would have called him, Ted, here's your manuscript. It's an enclosed manuscript. And I don't want to talk about that, but I've written all over it. He said, what I'd like to do is have you work for me. I was 26 years of age. The undersecretary of HEW was offering me a job. And all in this head of mine, filled with graduate school rules of the game, was what would the title be? Where would I be working? How would I know I was going to be taken seriously? Exactly where my office would be. You got the picture? That kind of craziness. Mr. Cohen started on the left side and started walking me around his big North Hall office. Now, Bruce Cohen, his son, is here today, and he'll know what I mean. All these pictures from Wilbur's history back to the University of Wisconsin in the 1930s, 1934, 35 exactly, when he came to Washington to work for his professor, Edwin Whitty, from the Committee on Economic Security. At every point he stopped and he said, Ted, are you interested? And I said, well, I'd ask one of the three questions. What would my title be? Where would I be working? And what would I be working on? He answered them deliberately with what I would regard now as considerable patience. But as we got around to sort of the end of the pictures, he said, well, Ted, you know what I'd like you to do is look at every piece of paper that comes into this office with the word Medicare on it, and you decide what I look at. Now, even I, at that time, could figure out that was an important task. But I couldn't help myself by saying, but where would I actually be sitting? To which he responded with a degree of both genial, exasperation. He pointed to a couch in his office, and he said, Ted, you can sit there. I said, I got it. I'm sorry. I apologize. I accept. When would you like me to come to work? He said, tomorrow. I said, my God, this is Tuesday, Wednesday. My parents are coming from California for the PhD ceremony. I can't not have them with me when we get. He said, when are they coming? When's the ceremony? Thursday, 5 o'clock. He said, fine. Friday, be here at 7 a.m. Now, you think this is the end, but it's not. I got there. The only way to get there from Cambridge, Mass, at that hour is to take an overnight train, which I had never in my California life ever experienced. I got there, and sure enough, at 8 o'clock, there was a staff meeting, and here is the big surprise, and I'll shift gears to more relevant contemporary concerns. He took me to a staff meeting, and the staff meeting was part of this huge apparatus on the North Hall. And I knew all the names, but I didn't know all the people except Bob Ball, whom I had interviewed. And there were a bunch of assistant secretaries and heads of sections of the government, the Public Health Service, Social Security Administration, and so on and so forth. He walked into the meeting. I was tagging along as I should. And he said, ladies and gentlemen, this is Ted Marmor. as if that was somehow important news. He's from Harvard, and I've got to go to the White House, and he'll speak for me. Now, I want to end this by saying there was an educational development over the course of this time. I did not say a thing for the whole meeting, thus illustrating the rapidity with which I could learn the lesson that I've been so slow to exhibit the day before. So that's my story to try to humanize how it is I came to play in this game. Now I want to turn to just 3 points. I mean, you want to know what John and Jerry and others and I believe? Take the book. I mean, I was going to say, maybe I should put a price on it for the economists who would feel bad of not getting something free. So if you want the details, it's all there. So I want to just make 3 observations, all illustrative of the claim that I want to make, that the discussion of social insurance ideas, principles, let alone practices, is at a sufficiently diluted level in American politics to warrant the attention by the National Academy that was really exhibited by Bob Ball and Wilbur Cohen when they tried to start the Academy all those decades ago. And let me give, as I say, these 3 illustrations. Take, for example, the discussion of social policies and whether or not they are entitlements. Now, under ordinary language, when we say someone's entitled to something, somebody else is obliged to deliver it if the entitlement is justified, right? Entitlement is a positive word. But over time, and this is something Mike Dukakis has actually said in some speeches, we have allowed the critics of social insurance to, in some ways, steal the positive moral energy associated with the entitlement to what it is you contributed to when you were in a position to need it. That's the fundamental social insurance idea. You're only entitled to it because you've done your part and you have pooled your efforts against risks to economic insecurity that anyone would have to be a fool or a knave not to acknowledge. Whether it's disability outliving your savings, it's medical care expenses, it's unemployment, it's injury, and so on, okay? Entitlements. How can we seize back this extraordinary feature which was central to President Roosevelt's conception of why social insurance was going to be such an important matter in the long run if we built it on a contributory basis? So that's point number 1. Now, there may be people who do not prefer a scheme as balanced as that. But I leave you with this point about entitlement. And that is, it is an intellectual roadway into a second point that's really important. And that is that the recipients of social insurance programs are the same people who are the contributors at another time in their life, or reverse it. The idea of social insurance is that you participate when you're working and contributing, and when and if you happen to face the threats to economic security, you receive them not as a matter of your current income, but rather of a schedule that is independent of your personal circumstances right then. That's the difference between means-tested programs and social insurance programs. We hardly remember this discussion. In fact, as an empirical illustration, John and Jerry and I in the book in front of you looked into the number of times in 1934-35 that the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, and the New York Times used the expression social insurance. And we compared it to both 1990 and actually 2010. And the number of times in 1935 was 80. And the number of times in 2010, was 8. And guess what the number was in 2010? in the middle of the so-called Great Reform, the so-called Obama reform, which I call the patchwork reform, which actually most people couldn't understand. Leave that aside. I know that in this town has many people who think it was the outer edge of virtue. I'm not interested in virtue. I'm interested in plausibility. But leave that, again, aside. Well, 3 people in 2010, 3 times in the course of a year in which there's legislation, something is wrong. We are not using we've lost a language of the very programs that are 40% of the American federal budget. You get the point, right? You may not agree with it, but I hope you get it. The next illustration. Not entitlements in this case, but close. Something, when we talk about programs that, what's the right way to put this? Let me put it this way. How do we talk about solvency of public programs in the United States, particularly at the federal level? And in what way does that connect to social insurance programs? Well, we have something called trust funds in this world. But what kind of trust funds are they? Are they funds like a private fund at Citibank that we can run out of money? No, it's not that. The idea about trust funds is the idea of holding on to the notion of a long-term commitment to pay those benefits and have trust that the funds will be available then. The point about Roosevelt's connection to this was trust, not funds. He was concerned about the political salience and solidity of trusting that the government would honor the claims made on behalf of the contributors financially and morally. Now, I have to say, this is a bizarre state of conversation in the United States. Take Medicare for a moment. Is Part B a function of trust funds? It's paid for by, at the moment, by general revenues and premiums. The conservatives in 1965, Mills and Long and Burns, were not willing to expand Medicare under ordinary Social Security principles, but they were willing to expand it by paying for it under public revenues, general revenues. Why would they want to do that? Well, the answer is they didn't want Medicare to be expanded along the lines of the people that we've been talking about, Ball and Cohen. So it was born of a political strategy. I think there are 3 people in the country who know this story, and 2 of them are dead. So what's the point of pointing this out? It's that the conversation about running out of money, a candidate for the public trusteeship in the Social Security Administration told me last week that he was really worried that Social Security would run out of money. Now, think for a moment. How plausible is that? The proportion of the population over 65 is increasing 50% between 2010 and 2020. It is popularly called the third rail of American politics, anybody who tries to cut it. So your population of entitled folks is growing in this period of time. It's this vivid, powerful constituency is going to sit by why the expenditures just go down to 0 and the trust fund goes. If you believe that's a reasonable bet, could we see each other later? It's idiotic. It will not happen. The probabilities of it are so low. I mean, there's some devastating environmental change that might produce it, but it's ridiculous. And yet people sensibly talk about either running out of money or they keep on talking about how much is in the trust fund. But if you got a trust fund of $1 billion and a debt of $1 billion, that's zero in terms of fiscal balance. That doesn't work. So thirdly, and maybe lastly, I'm not actually sure, Bill, how I'm doing. In a classroom, I can decide. But I don't want to push that too far, so give me some guidance. What's the third illustration that I want to make about it? Maybe it would be better to give an example of something literally in the last 24 hours in one case and in the last 2 weeks in the other. The article in the New York Times that maybe you saw about 10 days ago in the business section, which talked about a slow-moving crisis in retirement, Social Security. First, be alert. To call a crisis something that's slow-moving is to engage. It's to engage in a form of self-delusion. But it sounds good, particularly apparently in the business section of the New York Times. In this article, and Bruce Vladeck seemed to agree with me in his negative evaluation of this thing, there was not one mention of any of the things I've been talking about. Not one. He did not interview anybody who seemed to actually employ categories like social insurance. All he did was talk about forecasts of expenditures under current tax arrangements and forecasts of revenues, and then said, my God in heaven, if you keep going, in which the outlays are greater than the inflows, that's a real insight. Really, it's very important in the New York Times. And my daughter is an editor at the New York Times, and she knows that this is bad thinking, but it's... I read this article, and I almost despaired. I mean, I was 80 in February, and I still play squash, but I'm getting slower. So I need to have things speed up a little bit in improvement. This was not a good Sunday reading that. So now jump forward, and this will be my last, I think, Bill, this will be my last point. Bill, whichever Bill. I promise this will be the last one. Oh, God. On Morning Joe, which some of you may watch, I must confess, it's early in the morning, and it's seldom that I watch it. But I thought, because of the debate on Wednesday, this morning, before I left from New York, there might be something that would be important that would come up. And some young man, very fresh-faced, very appealing looking, and in all sort of superficial senses, a likable chap. That's before he opened his mouth. He turned to Blasio and said, how can you possibly defend Medicare for all? And de Blasio said, pretty easily, it's a better idea. I didn't think that was a great answer, but I didn't think it was a great question either. Then he went on, and here's my point, and it's a really serious one for me. He said, Mr. Mayor, are you really for a program that takes people's choice of having their own health insurance out of possibility with a plan called Medicare for All? De Blasio didn't face the sort of misunderstandings implicit in. He said, I'm for that because we're doing so badly. So it was an analysis of trouble rather than remedy. And I thought to myself, did this journalist, did it occur to them that we have a program operationally now called Medicare? And that if it were the case that extending Medicare, the program we have, were done, presumably one option would be extending the program as it is. And then you'd be forced to notice that private health insurance fills in the boundaries of Medicare. I'm not saying that's a great thing, but they have been driven out of business, nor has it happened in Canada for the areas not covered. So the confusion is between a set of particular zealots who want to get rid of private health insurance, which I can understand, and that's a separate argument. Those zealots are acting as if you could not extend Medicare without blowing out the private health insurance in one fell swoop. Now, of course you'd change it. You changed it in 1965, 66 too. My point is, and this is where I leave you, good God, what a failure of the educated journalists in America to be engaging in that kind of know-nothing discussion of something really important. Other than that, things are fine. Thank you very much.